It was in the fall of 2021 when I hiked a remote stretch of the Appalachian Trail with two friends in North Carolina. We had planned for a week-long trip, eager to disconnect from city life and lose ourselves in the quiet vastness of the wilderness. The trail was breathtaking, surrounded by towering trees that seemed untouched by time, their golden leaves crunching beneath our boots. The first 2 days passed without issue, long hikes, campfire stories, the occasional deer watching us from the brush. It felt safe, peaceful, but on the third night, everything changed. We had made camp in a small clearing, the kind that felt like it had been waiting for travelers for centuries. The sky had darkened early, clouds swallowing the moon, making the forest around us seem endless. We ate in silence, the only sounds the distant hoots of an owl and the crackling of the fire. That's when we heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, just beyond the trees. At first we assumed it was another hiker, maybe someone passing through on their own journey, but as the minutes stretched on, the footsteps continued, circling us, never coming closer, never fading away. I called out, asking if someone was there. No response. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving only an unbearable silence. My friend, trying to shake the unease, joked that it was probably an animal, but no animal walks like that. No animal knows to stop when you acknowledge it. We laughed it off, pretending it didn't bother us. But as I lay in my tent that night, every tiny sound made my skin crawl. The wind through the branches, the distant rustle of leaves, the soft crunch of footsteps just outside my tent. I barely slept, and by morning the atmosphere had shifted. The forest felt different, as if the trees were listening, as if the trail ahead had grown unfamiliar overnight. We hiked in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The deeper we went, the worse the feeling became. That itching sensation on the back of my neck, the certainty that if I turned too quickly I'd see something just out of sight. The air felt heavy, the woods too quiet. By midday we reached a ridge overlooking a valley, and that's when we saw it. A cabin. It hadn't been on our map. It shouldn't have been there at all. Old, weathered, standing at the base of the hill like it had been waiting for us. The roof sagged, the windows gaping black holes, the wood long since greyed with age. A single rocking chair sat on the porch, swaying ever so slightly, though there was no wind. Something was wrong with that place. My friend suggested we check it out, maybe take shelter from the coming rain, but every instinct in my body screamed no. I told them we should keep moving. Now. There was something off about that cabin. Something that made my stomach twist in ways I couldn't explain. The longer we stared, the more wrong it looked. Like the angles weren't quite right. Like the door was too dark, too wide. My friend, standing beside me, whispered under his breath. The rocking chair had stopped moving. We left immediately, picking up our pace, refusing to look back. The path twisted, the trees closing in, and no matter how far we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't really left, that the cabin was still there, just out of sight. The air grew colder, the shadows stretched too long, and as the sun began to set, the footsteps returned, not behind us, not in front, beside us. Something was walking in the trees, keeping pace, moving when we moved, stopping when we stopped. I could feel it watching, could hear the faintest whisper of breath between the branches. My pulse hammered as I forced myself to keep walking. Faster. Don't look, don't acknowledge it. The moment stretched unbearably thin, the forest pressing in closer with every step. Then, a voice. Not loud, not calling out, just a whisper, right next to my ear. You should have stayed. My body locked up, ice flooding my veins. I didn't turn, I didn't run, I just kept walking. My friends were pale, their eyes darting wildly, but none of us spoke, none of us acknowledged what we had heard. The footsteps followed us all the way to camp. That night we didn't set up a fire, we didn't talk, we sat awake, clutching our knives, staring into the darkness, knowing something was out there. The air was too still, the trees too quiet. Every so often I swore I could see movement between the branches, glimpses of something tall, something watching. By morning, we packed up and left, hiking faster than we ever had, and when we finally reached civilization, when we finally stepped back into the real world, the forest let us go. The air felt lighter, the trees felt normal again. But as I threw my gear into the back of my car, I caught sight of something, a footprint, not one of ours, too large, too deep, facing the road like it had been watching us leave, had been watching us. It was early spring of 2022 when I decided to hike a lesser-known section of the Appalachian Trail in West Virginia. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, but something about this one felt different from the start. Their air had a strange weight to it, the kind that made every sound feel muted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I told myself it was just the isolation, the lack of other hikers on the trail, but deep down I knew something was off. The first day went smoothly. I made good time, setting up camp near a small clearing where the trees parted just enough to let the last bit of sunlight spill through. The silence was deafening out there, no cars, no distant hum of civilization, just the occasional rustling of leaves. I forced myself to relax, to enjoy the solitude, but the feeling never left. That creeping sensation that something was just out of sight, watching, waiting. The fog rolled in during the second day. Thick and heavy, it swallowed the trees, making the trail vanish in front of me. I had checked the forecast before I left. No mention of fog, no warnings of sudden weather shifts. But here it was, stretching endlessly in every direction, muffling the world around me. The trees became nothing but dark, twisting silhouettes, their forms barely visible through the haze. The deeper I walked, the more disoriented I became. My compass still worked, my map still made sense, but my instinct screamed that I was lost. Then I heard it, a voice, faint, drifting through the trees. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I strained to listen, the words became clearer. It was calling a name, repeating it over and over, slow and rhythmic, like a chant. The voice wasn't panicked, wasn't searching, it was luring. I gripped my pack tighter, forcing myself to keep moving. I wasn't going to call back, I wasn't going to acknowledge it. But with every step, the voice grew closer. I changed direction, quickening my pace, the fog thickening around me like a living thing. Another voice joined the first, then another, more overlapping, whispering just beyond my vision. My breath came faster, my chest tightening as the voices grew louder, weaving together in a sound that was almost melodic. They weren't searching. They were singing. A shape emerged in the fog ahead. At first, I thought it was another hiker, relief flooding through me. But as I stepped closer, my stomach twisted. It wasn't a person, it was a tree. But the way the branches stretched, the way the bark twisted, it looked almost human. The silhouette of it standing alone in the mist made my skin crawl. My body screamed for me to turn back, to run, but something deep inside me whispered, "Stay." I forced myself to look away, to move. But the fog felt thicker now, pressing against me like hands trying to pull me back. The voices were louder. I couldn't tell if they were coming from ahead or behind, if they were real or just inside my head. The names they chanted blurred together, forming something I almost understood. Then the whispering stopped. The silence was worse. The air around me was too still, too heavy. And then I felt it, a presence. Not behind me, beside me. I didn't look, I didn't move. The fog shifted slightly, and out of the corner of my eye I saw it. A shape, tall, too tall, motionless, no sound, no breath. Just standing there, just within my peripheral vision. I ran. I don't remember how far or how long, just the sheer terror pounding through my veins, the need to get away. The voices didn't chase me, they didn't need to. The further I ran, the more I felt like I was running in circles, like the trail itself was shifting beneath my feet. I could barely see my own hands in the fog, but somehow I kept going. And then, as suddenly as it came, the fog lifted. I stumbled into an open clearing, gasping for air, my legs trembling. The sun had started to set, the last light staining the horizon. My body ached, my lungs burned, but the voices were gone. The forest was normal again. I don't know how I found my way back. I don't remember packing up camp or retracing my steps. All I know is that when I finally reached my car, I felt like I had barely made it out. I checked the map that night, trying to figure out where I had gone, where that fog had come from. There was nothing. No reports of strange weather, no reason for me to have gotten lost where I did. But the worst part? The name. The name the voices had been calling. The one they kept repeating. It was mine. It happened in the fall of 2022, deep in the Appalachian Mountains on a remote stretch of the trail in North Carolina. I had been hiking solo for a few days, enjoying the silence, the isolation, the way the dense forest seemed to swallow all sound except for my own footsteps. The weather had been unpredictable, thick fog rolling in out of nowhere, turning the trail into an eerie, muted dreamscape. It was peaceful in a way until it wasn't. On my third night I set up camp in a small clearing just off the main trail. The fog had settled thick between the trees, curling low to the ground, making everything beyond a few feet disappear into a swirling grey void. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. I built a small fire, ate a quick meal, and turned in early, wrapping myself tightly in my sleeping bag as the forest hummed with the usual nighttime sounds. Crickets, distant owl calls, the occasional rustling of something small moving through the underbrush, nothing unusual. I woke up sometime past midnight. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had died down to smoldering embers, and the fog had grown so thick that it pressed against the walls of my tent like a living thing. I lay there listening, feeling the weight of the silence outside. No crickets, no wind, just an emptiness that felt too unnatural. Then a sound, something breathing. It wasn't close at first. It came from somewhere deep in the fog, a slow, wheezing inhale followed by an even slower exhale, a wet, strained sound like someone struggling to breathe through waterlogged lungs. It sent an icy chill crawling up my spine. I held my breath, listening as it drew closer, the weight of its presence pressing in. I reached for the knife I kept beside me, gripping the handle so tightly my knuckles ached. Then the breathing stopped. For a long, stretching moment there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the suffocating fog curling outside my tent. My muscles tensed, my heart hammering against my ribs as I strained to hear anything. And then, a footstep right outside my tent. The fabric barely moved, but I felt it. The air inside the tent grew impossibly cold, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Another step, closer this time. The ground shifted under the weight of something large. My mind raced. A bear? No, this was different. It was deliberate. Watching, waiting, I forced myself to move, slowly, carefully, unzipping the inside pocket of my tent where I kept my flashlight. My fingers fumbled, shaking as I clicked it on. The weak beam barely cut through the fog, but it was enough to catch a shadow. A shape, tall, too tall. Its limbs were elongated, stretched in ways that weren't natural. Its skin, if it even had skin, was mottled, shifting with the fog as if it was the fog. And its face, I never saw its face, because the moment the light touched it, the thing lurched back, not stepped, not ran. It snapped like reality had bent around it, yanking it away. The weight of its presence disappeared, the air rushing back into my lungs as if I had been drowning without realizing it. I didn't move. I sat there frozen, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The fog outside remained thick, but the thing was gone, or at least it wanted me to think it was. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my knife in one hand, my flashlight in the other, listening for the breathing to return. It never did. By sunrise, the fog had thinned and the forest was alive again, birds chirping, leaves rustling, the normal sounds of morning. But when I finally unzipped my tent and stepped outside, I saw them, footprints, leading up to my tent. But there were no footprints leading away. I packed up and left immediately, hiking faster than I ever had in my life. The entire way down the trail I felt it, a presence just out of sight, watching, following. The fog never fully lifted that day, and even after I made it back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had seen me that night, and worse, it let me go. The Appalachian Trail is filled with stories, some whispered around campfires, some never spoken at all. People vanish, shadows move where they shouldn't, and sometimes something follows you home. Because out there in the endless woods, you're not alone. If these stories gave you chills, like, share and subscribe for more terrifying, true horror stories. And don't forget to hit the bell icon, because the scariest things happen when you least expect them. Stay safe, and if the fog rolls in, don't stop walking.